Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're taking a truly forensic look at one of the absolute most difficult, heavily debated historical texts in the entire Old Testament. We're talking about a narrative that, on its surface, totally shocks modern sensibilities. But, as you'll see when we dig into the philosophical arguments surrounding it, it actually reveals a highly structured debate about the nature of justice, warfare, and history itself. We're unpacking the dialogue around the Amalekite enigma and looking at whether these ancient texts depict a genuine divine command or, merely a tribal vendetta. So get ready, because we're going to break this complex subject down slide by slide to make sure you can really grasp every angle of this historical and theological puzzle.
Section 1. The controversial command, which is found specifically in 1 Samuel 15.
So this specific biblical text serves as the focal point, kind of the crime scene for today's investigation. It's right here that the intense debate between divine judgment and human warfare really collides. The mandate reads, "Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have. Slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass." Look, read neutrally, it is absolutely impossible to deny how harsh and jarring this generational decree reads to us today. It is a totalizing command of destruction. It leaves literally no room for interpretation on the page.
Which immediately brings us to the skeptic's primary challenge, summarized perfectly by this question right here. Is this a divine command or a tribal vendetta? Think about it. If a modern nation launched an assault today, claiming it was just retaliation for an ambush their ancestors suffered centuries ago, we would immediately label that a vicious cycle of tribal vengeance. How, the skeptic asks, is this ancient mandate any different from a typical bloody regional clash?
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 2. Who were the Amalekites? The historical context of a predator state. To understand the theologian's counterargument, we have to trace this history. As we walk through this timeline, starting way back in Exodus 17, the text notes that when Israel fled Egypt, the Amalekites didn't just fight a standard border war. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't a standard war at all. They targeted the weak, the elderly, and the children lagging at the very back of the camp. They were, according to the source, operating as an active terrorist entity exploiting the vulnerable. Hundreds of years later, during the period of the Judges, they're still at it, persistently invading, burning agricultural fields, slaughtering communities. It's a continuous, unbroken line of predatory behavior leading right up to King Saul in 1 Samuel 15, and, as we'll see in a minute, stretching even further into the book of Esther.
Early in the text, the command begins with God saying, "I remember that which Amalek did." Now, the source makes a really crucial linguistic distinction here. The phrase "I remember" in this ancient context isn't meant to be read as some petty, lingering human grudge. It's not holding a grudge. Rather, the text frames it as formal covenantal language. It signifies a vertical, cosmic, judicial decree against a persistent, unyielding evil that literally refused to change its predatory nature for centuries.
Moving on to Section 3. King Saul's ulterior motives and the illusion of mercy. When we look at King Saul's specific involvement and his reaction to this severe command, his initial actions might actually look to the modern reader like a rare moment of humanitarian compassion cutting through a completely brutal mandate. The text tells us, "But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen, and would not utterly destroy them." So Saul spares Agag, the Amalekite king, and he keeps the best of the livestock. And this is the specific act of disobedience that, according to the narrative, causes Saul to lose his kingship entirely. But wait, why was this seemingly merciful act punished so severely?
Well, now what's really interesting about this is how the dialogue exposes Saul's true motives. It wasn't mercy, it was geopolitical greed. First off, in the ancient Near East, sparing and parading a captured foreign king was an act of supreme political vanity. It was a massive ego boost for the conqueror. Second, keeping the best livestock was very clearly for economic gain and plunder. Third, and honestly, most importantly for the theologian's argument, Saul took a solemn vertical act of divine judicial execution and downgraded it. He turned it into a dirty, horizontal clan clash for resources and bragging rights.
Which brings us to Section 4. The cost of disobedience and the historical ripple effect. The source points out that this mandate, specifically the total ban on taking any plunder whatsoever, was not just arbitrary harshness, it was actually a strict moral safeguard. On the left here, we see human greed and plunder, which is exactly what drives empire building and resource wars, and it's exactly what Saul gave into. But on the right, we have the mandate's actual intent, moral purity and safeguard, but commanding that absolutely nothing be taken, not even the cattle. The economic incentive for war was entirely removed. Israel was strictly forbidden from enriching themselves through this conquest. I mean, think about it. If they kept the gold and the sheep,
it would instantly become just another tribal land grab. The severity was specifically meant to keep the act purely judicial.
And just to further dispel the illusion that Saul was sparing an innocent man, the text provides this incredible confrontation from the prophet Samuel to King Agag. He says, "As thy sword hath made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women." This really establishes the source's claim that King Agag was an active, brutal warlord who personally perpetuated this violence. He was the head of a terror state, folks, not some peaceful bystander caught in the crossfire.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive historical irony discussed in the dialogue. Because Saul failed to treat the judgment seriously and left that predatory system intact, there were immediate, devastating historical consequences. Just a few chapters later, in 1 Samuel 30, the surviving Amalekites burn the city of Ziklag and take all the women and children captive. And then centuries later, in the book of Esther, the man who attempts to orchestrate the total genocide of the Jewish people is Haman the Agagite. Yes, a direct descendant of the very king Saul selfishly spared.
Finally, Section 5, Warfare versus Divine Judgment and the Metaphilosophical Conclusion. The theologian's concluding thesis draws a really stark line here. Human warfare, which we've got represented on the left, inherently seeks to take, to dominate, and to aggrandize for its own power. Divine judgment, however, represented on the right, and yes, even at its absolute most severe and difficult to read, is described as a surgical removal of a terminal moral malignancy from the human timeline. The ultimate goal, according to the source, is purely to protect the broader redemptive history of the world from a force that would otherwise completely destroy it. So that leaves us with this final, provocative thought. Does viewing this harsh narrative through the lens of removing a terminal moral malignancy actually change how we understand ancient historical texts? Does it provide a coherent philosophical framework for texts that otherwise seem, well, purely barbaric? Or does it merely complicate them further for the modern mind? It's a really profound dilemma for sure, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring these philosophical implications on your own. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.